We turn now to two talks on childbirth. The first will be given by Professor Yael Benyamini, a health psychologist and professor at the Bob Chappell School of Social Work at Tel Aviv University. Yael's research interests are in perceptions of health and their effects on ways of coping and on physical and mental health outcomes, with a special focus on women's health issues. She has investigated women's choice of modes of delivery, the factors related to this choice, and its association with the subjective and objective experience of childbirth, as well as coping with infertility, high-risk pregnancy, and miscarriage. Her talk today is titled Childbirth Between Expectancies and Experience. So please welcome Professor Benyamini.
I downloaded a template from Microsoft PowerPoint website, and it has this beautiful pictures of landscape. And you're coming from all over the world. Why should I show you landscapes from other places? So I replaced all the pictures with pictures of flowers from Israel, taken by myself and my friends and family. They were all taken between January and March of the either this year or recent years. So enjoy the pictures along the way. There are not very many of them, but I think they're beautiful. And you know, the take-home message of my talk is in the title, but I think you want a little evidence to convince you that this is a major issue, what happens between what women expect and what actually happens in childbirth. So I'll not end the talk here. I will give some evidence. Images of childbirth have been around forever in every culture, in every historical time. And, you know, I was thinking whether I should just maybe ask everybody to just throw associations of what childbirth means to them, or jot down associations. It would have been a very interesting exercise to do, only we don't have the time for that. So I did what you did and Googled associations for the word childbirth. And actually, it turns out that there's a website that gives you associations for practically every word in the dictionary. And the list for childbirth is very long, and it starts with giving, give, mother, child, parent, expectancy. But it goes on and includes other words too, like defect, mortality, retardation, abnormality. I think this is one way of showing how complex childbirth is. There's a guy in Israel, Dr. Chaim Shapira. He's a mathematician, philosopher, very engaging speaker. I'm sure Israelis here have heard his name or maybe have heard him. And he says that when he asks women, what was the happiest event of your life? In an audience of women who, most of them are mothers, 90% say, the birth of my first child. Now, when you ask men, they're a bit at loss with that question. It takes them time to answer, and their answers are spread over very many answers. I mean, some men do say the birth of my first child, but they are not a majority, definitely nowhere close to 90%. So it's another way of saying that childbirth and everybody involved in it, it's a very complex experience. Now, where does this start? Not in history, but in the personal lives of women. And, oh, sorry, before I go into it, all the data I'm going to present comes from two studies. Study 1 includes 850 women recruited at gestational age of 14 weeks and above that. The mean was 30, about 40% were primiparous, which is women in their first pregnancy. They were recruited in 6 women's health centers in the Metro Tel Aviv area and in the community and websites, mostly geared towards natural birth, home birth, because we wanted to get the entire range from cesarean sections, even by maternal request, to home birth. And 250 of these women were recruited early enough so that we could give them another questionnaire at least 8 weeks later, so that we could also look at changes along the pregnancy. Study 2 includes 976 women They were recruited at gestational age 24 weeks and above, about 43% primiparous. The data that I will present today is partly from this subsample and from Heidi Price's, raise your hand, Heidi. So well, she has pink in her hair, you won't miss her. Part of it is from her dissertation, which will soon be submitted. They were recruited in one hospital for women's health centers, and again, also the community through home midwives and other ways to get at the more, or the less prevalent ways of giving birth in Israel, the more natural options. And these women were also followed up 2 and 6 months postpartum. In both studies, the women we recruited were mostly Jewish, married or cohabiting, with relatively high education in the Metro Tel Aviv area. So it's not a representative sample of Israel. What's important to state is that when we recruited them, all women could potentially have a vaginal birth. Even if they expressed interest in the cesarean section, we excluded women who did not have the option of a vaginal birth. Now, there are 2 really important differences between these 2 studies. First is that the first study was intended to study women's choices. How do they want to give birth? And the factors that affect these choices. But after that, we said, okay, we know what they wanted, but how did they actually give birth? Did it happen the way they wanted? So we said, let's call them. We called them by phone, a very short conversation, 6 to 8 weeks after they gave birth, and we asked them, how did the birth go? Which interventions did you or did you not receive? All kinds of factual questions, and very few questions about different aspects of their experience and of their satisfaction with birth. And there it was. The difference, or where there was a huge difference between what they planned, what they chose, what they preferred, as they told us when they were pregnant, and what actually happened, was a major factor in their experience, in their emotions, in their satisfaction. And that's how study 2 came about, which also looks at their choices, but follows them up further enough with detailed questioning, not just this short phone call, to know a lot about their birth experience and a lot about later outcomes. The second difference between these 2 studies is that Heidi was a master's student in a group of students in study 1. She's a doctoral student and the coordinator of study 2, and it's a very ambitious study. We will, this is partial data, we will soon have over 1,800 women. And another hospital in Jerusalem, which is mostly religious women, so we will also have all kinds of interesting cultural comparisons, but for that we'll have to have another workshop in a year or 2. So, women's expectancies, and I started with saying, when does it begin? And we also had a small sample of women who never gave birth. They're in a stable relationship or married, they're not pregnant at the moment, they never gave birth before. And look at the green bars. These are different aspects, different dimensions of fear of childbirth. And they're higher in almost every dimension of fear of birth. The green bars are women who have not been pregnant, and still they carry around this image of childbirth, and it is quite a scary one. It's a negative one, much more negative than women who are actually pregnant at the moment. If we go into the first pregnancy, what happens along this pregnancy? And here I'm going to show you data about women's attitudes towards the medicalization of childbirth, and the higher the score, the more favorable their attitudes are. And I must mention that childbirth in Israel is highly medicalized. And you can see the green line, which is practically straight, there's no significant difference there, is women who are in their second or later pregnancy, and there are no changes along the way. But primiparous women, their attitudes towards medicalization become less favorable as they go from the second to the third trimester of their pregnancy. So it's actually becoming more kind of natural in their views in a medicalized society, and it's not very clear what's going on here, but what is clear is that if you want to affect women's perceptions of childbirth, you might as well try in the first pregnancy, or maybe even earlier, but not in the later pregnancies, because they're not so malleable anymore. So, is birth a natural or medical event? In developed countries, where most women give birth in a hospital? It's a good question, isn't it? Basic beliefs about birth as a natural and safe process, or as a medical and risky process, may underlie many other perceptions of childbirth. This is a concept that Heidi developed, and developed a scale validated to measure this concept. And when you look at the data, this is only in the sample of women in their first pregnancy. The response scale goes from 1 to 5. So look at the scale for the belief of birth as a natural event. The mean is very high, the variance is very low. So almost everyone all these women endorse this kind of natural model of birth. But when you look at the medical scale, and by the way, they're separate scales. They are negatively correlated, but not very highly. So they're clearly separate scales. The medical mean is lower, the variance is larger. So here women differ. They're spread out in their views. And this raises the question of, well, what is happening here? Do we grow up with this myth of this cultural image of birth as being something natural, but then many women don't really believe that they will get to birth in a natural way? So are we really talking about women walking around with this natural myth, but a medical reality? And what does that do to your fear of birth, to the actual experience during birth? Clearly means that women walk into the labor room with a lot of uncertainty. And that's clear even from knowing that birth is a very unpredictable and uncontrollable process. And what we do in face of uncertainty is gather information, seek ways to increase control. And control is a major issue in childbirth. You know, drop a stone in the childbirth literature, you're bound to hit control in some way or another. But control over what? You know, when you look at the health psychology literature, usually there's talk about self-control, but what are you really trying to control in birth? Are you trying to control the birth process, the birth environment? Are you really looking to the staff, to the healthcare providers, and are looking for them to control whatever is happening during your childbirth? So even control in itself in childbirth is a complex process. And to understand this process, we used, among other sources of inspiration, Walker's unifying model of control, which really argues that there are two separate dimensions, self-control and medical staff control, and the combination between them would determine your experience. And you can see that both of them are low. That's the red square. You're bound to feel anxiety, fear, depression. You know, not feeling any type of control is a negative experience. If one of them is high, that actually could be good, because if you don't have control, but you feel that the staff is in control over what is happening, you might feel dependent, but maybe safe. That's good if you did not want self-control. It could be a very negative experience if you wanted control and the staff is controlling everything. The other way around, if you feel control, if the staff is not taking too much control and you do feel in control, maybe you feel very confident, very empowered. This might be a very positive experience. And then when both are high, two sources of control could create a lot of tension, a lot of conflict, but could also be a recipe for a very positive experience if there's good communication, good cooperation between the woman and the people supporting her in the birth room. So this is one way to try to tease out this complexity. Now I'm going to try to put all of this together. This is a structural equations model, so it's going to look a bit overwhelming, and I'll try to walk you through the important parts really quickly, because this is only part of the talk. I said childbirth is a complex issue. Look at this. That's the end point. We're trying to predict the number of natural birth choices. Now, a natural birth choice could be an active choice to do something, to choose my position during birth, things like that, or it could be actively rejecting medical interventions. The starting point, which we believe is underlying all this, is the basic beliefs about birth as a natural or a medical process. And look what happens if you look at the medical perceptions of birth as a medical process. They're related to higher fear of birth, to more need for staff control of the birth, to more need for self-control over the birth process, which biologically is not really controllable. And all this leads these women to choose fewer natural birth choices. If you look at the natural belief, they're related to lower fear of birth, to more need for control over the birth environment, absolutely no relationship to other types of control. And all this leads both directly, if you see that black arrow above, and indirectly to more natural birth choices. So we've mapped many parts of the expectancies that women come with into the labor room and the relationships between them. But what actually happens there? One way to look at it is to just look at their general satisfaction. And you can see the satisfaction levels of women giving birth in different modes of birth, from emergency cesarean sections through planned cesareans, instrumental deliveries, vaginal delivery with epidural, without epidural, birth in a natural delivery room, and home birth. And if you take out the two emergency ways of giving birth, the emergency cesarean and the instrumental birth, all the other satisfaction levels on a 1 to 5 scale are 4 and above. So where am I with all this complexity that I'm talking about? Most women are happy. If nothing dramatic happened, if there are no emergencies, everybody's happy. What's the problem? Where's the complexity? Let me show you the same data in a slightly different way, where you can see the variance. Look at the right side. Women who gave birth in a more natural way. The variance is very, very low. They are truly, almost all, very satisfied with the birth experience. As you go more to the left, their responses are spread out over the entire response scale, including women who have had emergency birth, who may have had an extremely traumatic experience, some which I'll leave Susan to say more about later. Some of them are also extremely unhappy with the experience, yet some of them are way up high there. Maybe something happened, something dramatic happened, but they felt that the staff was there keeping them safe, keeping their baby safe. They're actually so happy that the outcome is positive that they're satisfied with something that must have been very dramatic somewhere along the way. Again, another way to show how complex this experience could be and how difficult it is to understand what's happening here. Fear of birth. I talked about it before. Can it affect what happens in the delivery room? Your guess? It affects or not? Yes, it does. And look at this. The reference group here is vaginal delivery without analgesia, with no epidural. For each 1 unit increase in fear of childbirth, look at all the rows above the reference group, you double your chances of various kinds of medical birth. And the most important part is this. You double your chances of unplanned medical birth. Birth by emergency cesarean section or by instrumental deliveries. Instrumental, it's even more than double. That's a huge risk factor. If you told physicians that smoking doubles the risk of cesarean sections, they'd all be talking to women about not smoking. They do talk to pregnant women about not smoking for other reasons. This is doing it. It's a psychological factor, and it's doubling women's risks. Another complicated model. I'll walk you through part of it that's relevant for this talk. This is part of Heidi's dissertation. And in this part, she looked at global birth satisfaction. And at actual birth, but not only at the actual way women gave birth, but at the incongruence between the way they planned to give birth and the way they actually gave birth. And this is controlling for actual birth. What you can see here is that incongruence with the birth plan has a very direct link to lower satisfaction with birth. The wider the gap between the way you plan to give birth and what actually happened, the less satisfied you are. It also has indirect effects. If you did not give birth the way you planned, you feel more guilty, and you're less satisfied with the care you received. And in both cases, again, this lowers your satisfaction. One last look about how these gaps between what I wanted, what I needed, what I said I would like when I was pregnant, and what actually happened there. And if it wasn't complicated enough, this is going to be a three-way interaction between need for staph control over birth, which was rated during pregnancy, actual staph control during birth, and the woman's satisfaction with the staph control. And we're trying to predict here different aspects of the emotional experience of childbirth. We had various dimensions. They're based on Susan's work on hotspots during childbirth. I'm going to show you just one dimension, the fear that women reported they felt during childbirth. And where's the complexity I was talking about? When women are satisfied with care, nothing matters. Doesn't matter whether they wanted the staph to be in control, whether the staph was actually in control, whether there are gaps between these two. When the care was good, was sensitive, when they felt they're being cared for, that there's good communication with the midwives and the doctors, nothing else mattered. What happens when they're not satisfied? Look at this. Look at the top red line. These are women who wanted the staph to be in control. And the more the staph was actually in control, the less fearful they felt. Look at the lower line of these top three. These are women who did not want the staph to take control. They wanted control. They didn't want the staph to determine everything. And the more the staph actually took control, these women felt more fear. So to conclude, expectancies regarding childbirth or perceptions of childbirth could include basic birth beliefs, attitudes towards the medicalization of childbirth, fear of birth, need and expectation of control during birth. The experience of childbirth is greatly affected by prenatal perceptions and by the incongruence between these perceptions or preferences and what happens at birth, in actual birth. Decreasing this gap, increasing control, and sensitive care can lead to greater satisfaction with birth, which I will add to that has many other implications on postpartum depressions, post-traumatic symptoms, on women's functioning as mothers, but that is a topic for another talk. Thank you.